There's a very specific feeling that some people in their late 30s and early 40s know almost too well. You hear a dial-up modem sound, a 90s song comes on, or you see an old photo from the early internet days, and your chest warms for a second. But right underneath that warmth is something quieter, a strange distance, as if you're remembering a world you belong to, but can't fully return to, and don't fully belong to now either. Psychology suggests this layered emotion is especially common among Xennials, those born roughly between the late 1970s and early 1980s, who grew up analog but entered adulthood digital. You remember life before constant notifications. You remember calling someone's house and hoping they were home. You remember boredom that wasn't immediately solved by a screen. And yet, you also adapted. You learned email, social media, smartphones, remote work. You crossed the bridge. But sometimes it feels like you're standing on that bridge, instead of fully on either side. Not quite old school, not quite fully digital native. Nostalgia hits, but it doesn't feel simple. It feels layered, almost bittersweet. Psychology often describes nostalgia as a stabilizing emotion, a way the mind reconnects with identity during times of change. But for Xennials, that nostalgia can come with a subtle sense of dislocation. You're not just remembering childhood. You're remembering an era that disappeared rapidly. Technology didn't slowly evolve, it accelerated. Social norms shifted. Communication transformed. Entire industries were rewritten. And you adapted in real time. So when you feel nostalgic yet slightly disconnected, it may not be confusion. It may be the emotional echo of living through two cultural worlds at once. This isn't about longing for the past because the present is bad. It's about having witnessed a shift so profound that your internal timeline sometimes feels split. Part of you still remembers the pace of life before everything sped up. Another part of you functions seamlessly in the speed. And sometimes those two parts don't fully blend. They coexist. That coexistence can feel isolating in subtle ways, especially when younger generations don't remember what you remember, and older generations didn't transition the way you did. But what if this feeling isn't a flaw in belonging? What if it's the psychological imprint of being a bridge generation? One that understands. Contrasts deeply because psychology suggests that when a generation experiences rapid cultural change during formative years, identity can develop with a dual structure, part rooted in one era, part shaped by another. For many Xennials, childhood was structured around physical presence, slower information cycles, and clear boundaries between work, home, and social life. Then adulthood arrived alongside constant connectivity, algorithm-driven feeds, and blurred lines between public and private identity. That transition didn't just change habits. It subtly shaped the nervous system's expectations about how the world works. You learned patience in one environment and adaptability in another. You learned to wait, and then you learned to respond instantly. That contrast can create an internal rhythm that feels out of sync with both younger and older generations. When Gen Z speaks fluently in digital culture, it can feel like they were born native to a language you had to consciously learn. And when older generations talk about the good old days, it can feel like they never had to recalibrate their identity midstream. Psychology sometimes refers to this as transitional identity tension, when a person develops stability in one context and then must re-anchor themselves in a dramatically different one. It doesn't mean instability. It means expansion happened quickly. There's also something called collective memory anchoring, the idea that shared cultural experiences shape how bonded people feel to their peers. Xennials' shared memories include mixtapes and Napster, encyclopedias and Wikipedia, landlines and iPhones. But the cultural shelf life of those experiences was short. The world moved on fast. So sometimes nostalgia doesn't just feel warm, it feels like holding a photo from a version of society that no longer exists in recognizable form. That can produce a quiet sense of emotional displacement, even if life is objectively stable. You might feel technologically competent, yet emotionally tired of constant digital noise. You might appreciate progress, yet miss simplicity. You might feel connected online, yet strangely detached in real life. Interactions that feel more curated than spontaneous. None of this suggests dissatisfaction or dysfunction. It suggests you remember contrast. And remembering contrast can heighten awareness. when you've experienced both slowness and speed, privacy and visibility, patience and immediacy. You naturally become more reflective about what was gained and what was lost. That reflection isn't resistance. It's depth formed through transition. And sometimes depth feels like standing, slightly outside the current moment, not because you don't belong, but because you've seen how quickly now can There's also a quieter psychological layer. Beneath the nostalgia, something less about technology and more about timing. Many Xennials entered adulthood during economic shifts, global uncertainty, and changing definitions of success. Psychology suggests that when major societal transitions overlap with early adult identity formation, people can develop what's sometimes called adaptive realism, a mindset that is flexible, observant, and cautious all at once. You grew up hearing that if you worked hard and followed the path, things would stabilize. Then the path changed. Industries evolved. Career ladders flattened. Social media altered comparison. The definition of making it became more ambiguous. So while you carry nostalgic warmth for simpler cultural moments, you may also carry a subtle skepticism about long-term stability. Not fear, just awareness. That awareness can create a strange duality. You remember optimism, yet you matured inside complexity. You were old enough to remember life before 9/11, before smartphones, before the 24/7 news cycle, but young enough that those changes shaped your adult worldview. That positioning can produce a quiet sense of being historically alert. Psychology often finds that people who live through rapid structural change develop heightened contextual thinking, meaning you rarely see events as isolated. You connect dots. You remember how quickly things can shift. So when culture moves fast again, new apps, new norms, new crises, part of you adapts smoothly. Another part watches carefully. This can feel like disconnection in social settings. When conversations revolve around trends that feel temporary, you may struggle to invest emotional energy. When online culture amplifies intensity, you may feel slightly removed rather than swept up. It's not that you don't care. It's that your perspective is layered. You've seen hype cycles rise and collapse. You've seen technology promised as liberation and then become obligation. So your engagement is thoughtful, sometimes reserved. There's also the identity element of being in between. Not fully Gen X, not fully millennial. And humans tend to anchor identity through group belonging. When labels feel blurry, belonging can feel subtle instead of obvious. You may not loudly identify with generational memes, yet you feel a quiet resonance with others who remember rewinding, VHS tapes or burning CDs. That resonance doesn't always translate into visible community. It's more internal, a shared knowing. And when nostalgia surfaces, it can feel like reconnecting with a version of yourself that existed before constant recalibration was required. That's not regression. It's a reminder of continuity. You are the same person who learned to navigate two eras. But sometimes remembering the first one highlights how much adjustment the second required. And that awareness can feel like distance, even when you're functioning well with it. If you've ever felt nostalgic yet slightly untethered at the same time, it doesn't mean you're stuck in the past or failing to connect with the present. Psychology suggests it can simply reflect layered identity, the result of adapting across eras that moved at very different speeds. You're not behind. You're not out of place. You may just carry more context than most. And context can feel heavy in a culture that prefers immediacy. But there is something quietly powerful about remembering both the before and the after. It often creates discernment. You know what silence felt like before constant input. You know what friendship felt like before metrics. You know what waiting felt like before streaming. That memory doesn't make you resistant to progress, it gives you reference points. And people with reference points tend to think more deeply about meaning, time, and connection. The slight disconnection you sometimes feel may not be social failure. It can be reflective distance, a pause between stimulus and reaction, a space where comparison doesn't automatically dictate worth. That space can feel lonely in loud environments, but it can also feel grounding. Many Xennials developed emotional flexibility without losing introspection. You learned new systems without completely dissolving your earlier ones. And that dual awareness often produces quiet emotional intelligence, the ability to adapt while still observing the adaptation. There's something uniquely human about standing at a cultural crossroads and realizing you've lived through a transformation large enough to reshape how generations relate to each other. Not everyone experiences that. You did. And sometimes nostalgia isn't about wanting to go back. It's about honoring the version of you that grew up in a slower rhythm. The version that shaped your baseline before acceleration became normal. Feeling disconnected at times may simply be the mind's way of recalibrating between those rhythms. You belong to the present. You function in it. But you also carry a memory of contrast that younger generations never had to integrate in the same way. That integration process can be quiet and ongoing. And there's depth in that. If this perspective resonated, take a moment to notice which memories feel warm and which feel distant. Not to judge them, just to understand the layers of your own timeline. And if you're drawn to exploring the psychology behind identity, generational shifts, and the inner experiences that rarely get named, you can stay here and continue the conversation.